Welcome everyone to Tadaima 2023. My name is Rob Buscher and I'm the online film festival curator, and I'm very pleased to be joined this evening tonight by two incredible artists who are going to be talking about some of the works that they have done related to hibakusha and other bomb-affected peoples, but more importantly to kind of take stock of some of the Japanese and Nikkei perspectives on the atomic bombings of Japan. I would love to start off by having both of our panelists introduce themselves. Steven, would you like to go first?
Yes, let's see. I started as a filmmaker right out of college in 1976, and in 1980 I got involved with the hibakusha in the San Francisco area, and sort of noted that they seemed really separate from the Japanese community as a whole. In fact, they would have their Hiroshima memorial on August 6th in the Sumitomo Bank social room, and across the street, the Japanese American community would be having what they called the Nihon Machi Street Fair, and so there was a kind of really powerful disconnect between those two communities, and I was just thought it would be a interesting film subject that I really knew nothing about, for research I went to the Pacific Film Archive in Berkeley, and they had a film festival of films about the atomic bomb, and there must have been 6, 7, 8 films, and not only one of them, I mean, they all went into why of the bomb, the building of the bomb, the decision to drop the bomb, and only one of them had like just less than a minute of actual Hiroshima survivors. And so you have these people, all these historians and politicians and college professors talking about Hiroshima, and there are no Hiroshima survivors talking about it from their perspective. So I decided to make a film about it, and I think I was too young and inexperienced and wasn't happy with the initial film. It was called Survivors, and it was on PBS in 1982. And it gave some exposure to the subject, but I really wanted to try to return to the subject later. And so I made several attempts to do it, but finally, just out of the blue, HBO asked me if I wanted to do a film about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I said, what are you thinking about the focus? And they said, you should say everything and put everything in. This is a rare opportunity, because it really was. I mean, to get some, television entity to do something on Hiroshima and tell the story as I think it hadn't been told, which is just through the survivors and the people that dropped the bomb, but no scientists, no historians. And so that was an extraordinary experience, and that film, I guess, came out in, I don't know, 2000. I can't remember now. Well, it was a couple of years after the anniversary, would have been the 60th anniversary. So I guess it was 2007 or 8.
Yes, that was 2007 for White Light, Black Rain. And then also Mushroom Club the year before, 2006.
Yeah,
both of which are in this online film festival.
The Mushroom Club was a film. I thought, no one's going to let me do this film, and the 60th anniversary was coming up. So I just, my wife and I went to Hiroshima, and I just shot some of the stories. I mean, I have stayed close to some of the nonprofit peace groups in Hiroshima, and with some of the famous hibakusha of Hiroshima. And so the Mushroom Club was really, I just thought, well, if no one's going to give me funding, well, we got some small grants, but so I just thought, I'll feel terrible if I don't do something. So I made the one small film. And just as I was finishing that, HBO gave me the call to make the other film. So, and Hiroshima sort of remains really important to me. And I've watched, I made my first trip there in 1980. So I've watched the peace movement change. I've watched the big changes in the sort of the city itself and its acceptance of Korean hibakusha. They used to have a Korean memorial on a little traffic island next to the Peace Park, and now it's a prominent monument inside the park, and so that's always an issue of controversy too.
Yeah, well, thank you for that context, and we look forward to discussing your work at further length. At this point, I would love for Haruka to self-introduce, and then also, would you like to go into your short presentation afterwards? We figured that since most of the audience here has probably seen one or both of Steven's films as part of the Tadaima Festival, but Haruka's work has not been included in the film festival portion, it would be great for us to have a little more context before we launch into the panel discussion. So, Haruka?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, Rob and Steven. I just wanted to say that your work is so incredibly moving and so important in a time where I think we're all aware of the media censorship that has surrounded this topic. And I grew up in an environment where both of my parents are immigrants from Japan, and in their minds, hibakusha were a taboo. It was something that we didn't really speak about. So as much as I was encountering in American classrooms where the hibakusha narratives were being erased in Japan as well, I was I had a bit of a hard time accessing this information until pretty much up until 2017 when I started working on the projects that I'll be discussing today. So again, thank you so much for your work. And just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Haruka Sakaguchi. I am a documentary photographer based in New York City. My approach will be through still photography and portraits. I'd like to start off by presenting some slides. So what you're seeing up here, it's a spread that I have been working on. It's a project that I've been working on for the past 6 years now. It was actually published last month on National Geographic magazine. This is a long-term project that I've been working on called 1945. It addresses hibakusha, or atomic bomb survivors in Japanese, and their descendants in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When I shared copies of the magazine, obviously to celebrate, right? I shared copies of this magazine with my collaborators in Japan. There was a second generation hibakusha who I had the opportunity to photograph back in 2017. She wrote me a thank you note. It said, 亡くなった人は忘れられることで二度死ぬ, which roughly translates to, those who pass before us die a second time when they're forgotten. In other words, we humans experience two deaths, one when our physical bodies perish, and one when our memory is forgotten. So my collaborator, she thanked me for preventing the second death of her family members by preserving their memory in this magazine issue. And I wanted to share this with you all because I think many of us in the Nikkei community have also contended with this idea of preserving someone's memory, whether that's in the form of sharing what we know about a family member's incarceration or making a pilgrimage to the former camps. And I think many of us have also experienced a second death in our families through the erasure of camp stories and the intergenerational silence of our own family members. I'm grateful for this opportunity today to share my project with a Nikkei audience in particular, because many of us know what a second death feels like. And many of us, like those who are working hard behind the scenes right now to bring this incredible program together for us, have a vested interest in keeping our collective memories alive. So I'd like to start with by sharing some stories from my project. 1945. It's an educational website featuring portraits and testimonies by hibakusha and their descendants. And I'd like to talk about some of the lessons I've learned along the way. So what inspired this project? I touched on this a little bit in the beginning here, but it began with a history lesson from middle school, the school that I was attending here in the US, in which the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was portrayed as the sword of military necessity. Necessary evil was what the teacher said in his words. And it was justified as this necessary evil to end the bloodshed of World War II. And at this point in my life, I personally didn't know any hibakusha. I didn't have any family ties in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So there were little more than this kind of historical topic that people in my home country spoke about in these kind of hushed tones. And most people in my adopted home country here in the United States, they probably never read about. Still, I remember as a middle schooler, I was kind of growing agitated, right? As this American history teacher was summing up the deaths of over 200,000 people into these two simple words: necessary evil. What makes the bomb necessary? Was the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people warranted as long as it had supposedly ended the war? And as formative as this memory was, I actually didn't really revisit it, didn't think much of it until over a decade later in 2016, when I had met a Japanese woman named Keiko. This happened by pure happenstance while I was on a road trip in Montana. Keiko is a second generation hibakusha from Hiroshima. And she said that although she didn't experience the tragedy in person, because she's a child, she's a descendant of a hibakusha, that she was heavily stigmatized as a hibakusha while living in Japan. So eventually she met an American husband and she moved here to the US. And I remember asking Keiko, if she'd ever return to Japan. And she said that no, because she'd found healing here in America. And that was when I realized that, a lot like my middle school history teacher, I had this one-dimensional take on hibakusha. I think sitting with Keiko that day in her trailer in this remote Montana town that she now called home, I learned that hibakusha were not these monolithic victims of war, that everyone had their own story. So a year later, I decided to visit Japan to meet more hibakusha like Keiko. And from that point forward, I've been fortunate enough to meet hibakusha whom I can now call friends and mentors. These friends and mentors have guided me through this project over the past 6 years. I'll never forget the first hibakusha I had the privilege of meeting, who was Mr. Yoshiro Yamawaki. Mr. Yamawaki was 11 years old when he was exposed to the bomb in Nagasaki. And he and his brothers, they survived the bomb, but they later discovered their father's body near the factory where he worked. They watched in horror as piles of bodies were being dumped into a mass cremation site. So Mr. Yamawaki and his brothers, none of whom were older than 16 at this point, they mustered up the courage to pull their father's body out of the rubble and give their father the private cremation that he deserved. Mr. Yamawaki shares, My brothers and I gently laid his black and swollen body on top of a burnt beam in front of the factory where we found him dead and set him alight. His ankles jutted out awkwardly as the rest of his body was engulfed in flames. Here's an excerpt from his handwritten letter, which for this project I had asked each survivor to prepare in advance as a message to future generations. Mr. Yamawaki says, I have resigned to the fact that nuclear weapons will not be abolished during the lifetime of us first generation hibakusha. I pray that younger generations will come together to work toward a world free of nuclear weapons. Despite his harrowing past, Mr. Yamawaki, he dedicated much of his letter to his hope for future generations. In Hiroshima, I met Miss Taeko Teramae, who was exposed to the bomb when she was in high school. Her lifelong dream was to become a teacher, but she decided against it due to the injuries that she had incurred on her face during the bombing. During the interview, she said, I thought of ways that I could stay indoors without leaving the house. It seemed all I could ever do was fight one radiation disease after another. And here's an excerpt from her letter. I just like to live a healthy life with my children. This is Mr. Yasujiro Tanaka, who I actually noticed in your documentary, Steven. He made a very small appearance, but yeah, he was 3 years old at the time of the bombing. He was buried alive under the house, but miraculously he was saved by his uncle who pulled him out of the debris. Still, he was injured on his face, and he had lost hearing in his left ear due to the air blast. And Mr. Tanaka also shared that more than a decade after the bombing, his mother discovered glass shards growing out of her skin, which she presumed is debris from the day of the bombing. Mr. Tanaka's letter reads, "You are only given one life, so cherish this moment, cherish this day, be kind to others, be kind to yourself." And I wish I had the time to share everyone's stories today, but the last story I will share with you all today is that of Miss Kumiko Arakawa. When asked to write a message for future generations, she replied, "Nani mo omoitsukanai," or "I can't think of anything." Her daughter later told me that Miss Arakawa had refused to speak about the bomb to this day, and that she herself didn't know that she was a descendant until quite late into her adulthood. Miss Arakawa was not the only hibakusha who hesitated to write her letter or share her experiences of the bombing. In fact, there were many hibakusha who chose to stay silent about their memories. You know, as I continued this project, I learned about this document called the Hibakusha Techo, this pink document that you're seeing up here. It was administered by the Japanese government, entitling hibakusha to subsidize healthcare. I met hibakusha who had actually waited to apply for this booklet until after their children were married or employed. Why wait to apply for this booklet, especially if it guarantees you free healthcare? Well, because the booklet would reveal their status as a hibakusha. And these hibakusha, they feared that if people found out that their children were descendants, they would struggle to find work due to assumptions that hibakusha descendants have genetic health complications. They feared that their children would struggle to find a marriage partner if their family tree could be traced back to them. So what many of these hibakusha did, they carried their trauma in silence. The hellscapes that they'd witnessed right after the bombing, the grief that followed for many decades after, they carried it alone in silence to protect their loved ones. And after hearing this, I finally understood the true meaning behind Miss Arakawa's blank letter. My goal for this project was no longer just about preserving firsthand accounts of the atomic bomb, but it was also about acknowledging the hibakusha's silence, this protective silence, right? And cultivating, hopefully, a more nuanced understanding of why one would choose silence to protect their loved ones. And of course, intergenerational silence exists here in the Nikkei community as well. As many of you know, I'm currently working on Kampu, a project about survivors and descendants of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. And much like hibakusha, many survivors of the American concentration camps, they do not share their experiences with their descendants. And instead, some survivors may share only parts of their incarceration, say the baseball games and Obon festivals that they'd organized, maybe the kindness and tender moments that they shared with barrack neighbors. Why only focus on the positive experiences? Well, perhaps to protect their children from the stigma that they have carried throughout their lives. It's stories like this that depicts the true aftermath of what happened during World War II. And whether you've seen it or not, you're likely familiar with the debate around the film Oppenheimer and its failure to portray the hibakusha stories like the ones we've discussed. And like the film's critics, I'm also concerned about the erasure of hibakusha narratives and this attempt to humanize and even aestheticize this brutal attack against innocent civilians. But is an institution like Hollywood the appropriate platform for these stories? Should we be trusting Hollywood with the hibakusha's narratives? In Japan, the stories of hibakusha are told by designated storytellers called denshosha, who undergo a specialized training program to work with survivors and document their experiences. And as designated guardians of the survivors' memories, denshosha, they spend years working with individual survivor to prepare a presentation that tells their story fully and accurately. And they share these presentations across local schools and universities. Those who are not denshosha must tread very carefully when retelling the hibakusha stories, which is why on the 1945 website, I've focused on publishing letters written by the hibakusha themselves and worked closely with denshosha whenever I was publishing any interpretive text. And unfortunately, I think we'd all agree that we'd be hard pressed to find a similar level of dedication to precision and nuance, probably anywhere else in the world, let alone Hollywood. Rather than seeing a historically inaccurate and hyperbolic American interpretation of the hibakusha's experiences, I would entrust dedicated individuals like the denshosha to interpret these stories. We as Nikkei can appreciate the denshosha's dedication to accuracy and integrity because we're also retracing our own histories, right? And this is why we have, I think, a unique connection to the hibakusha stories. We understand the hibakusha's silence. We understand what it means to grieve a second death. The past 6 years have taught me that although there may be an ocean between us, the hibakusha and us Nikkei share the same dedication to protect the stories of our loved ones for future generations. And spaces like Tadaima reminds me that what lies beyond a second death is a rebirth, a ground for healing, restoration, and newfound connections. I'm truly honored to have been able to share both my 1945 project and my in-progress Kempu project with this community. If you'd like to learn more about the stories that we discussed today, feel free to visit 1945project.com. And if you'd like to stay up to date on the release of the Kempu website next year, I'll be sharing my social links in the chat. And again, I really appreciate you all for joining this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haruka, for that moving presentation. And I think you've done an incredible job sort of priming us for this conversation by drawing these connections between the Nikkei and the hibakusha and the denshosha and the action that I think many of us are attempting within the Nikkei diaspora to be that next generation of storytellers. And again, what an important reminder from our overseas cousins that we have much to learn yet about the stories of our elders before they have passed on. And I guess, just again, for a little more context on why we're having this conversation tonight at Tadaima, in the aftermath of the Oppenheimer film release, a number of us in the organizing committee were talking about the complete absence of the hibakusha and other Japanese narrative within this, and the actual perspectives and the harm and incredibly unimaginable tragedies that befell the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for generations after these atrocities. And this is why we decided, as part of the film festival, to organize a special section that looks at and platforms stories that are being told by Japanese filmmakers and Nikkei-jin filmmakers that are really giving an opportunity for the hibakusha narratives to be spoken in the words of the hibakusha themselves. So I think that's a really important focal point and something that I want us to kind of keep in mind going forward. And then just a few anecdotes related to sort of my connection to this topic. My Hio-ba-chan was a Kibe. She was born in Hilo, Hawaii, and at age 4 was sent to live with her grandparents in Hiroshima. And she lived there until she was 19 years old. She immigrated to the United States towards the end of the Taisho era. And, like many others of their generation, her and my great-grandfather and my bachan and her siblings were all forcibly removed from their farm and home in California in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And they were living inland in Utah when they found out this news that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. And when it was announced, what I've heard from my obachan was that her mother, my hibachan, was in an almost catatonic state for close to a month until she heard that her family had survived. And not all of them, mind you. 2 of her cousins, her dear cousins, were lost in the atomic bombing. One was a bank teller who worked in downtown Hiroshima, close to the A-bomb dome. The other was a school child who was on a field trip that day. And, those losses were immense, and they were felt sort of throughout our Nikkei family. And my mother was very close to her grandmother and became involved with the Hiroshima peace movement. Some of my early childhood memories are going with her to prepare for the 50th anniversary peace conference in Hiroshima in 1995. She brought a trip of American high school students to the peace conference, and I went with her to the trips in advance of that to talk about what the students would need to know and the kinds of preparation to be there in such a momentous occasion. And I think having these kinds of connections from a Japanese American perspective, it's understanding what war does on all sides of a conflict. It's understanding the devastation wrought by these atrocious weapons in Japan. It's understanding the generations of trauma then that have persisted from the mass incarceration and forced removal of the Nikkei. And I think we are in, as a community, and a unique position to speak with some type of moral authority around these topics. And of course, the experience of the hibakusha are things that only they can speak on. But as Nikkei-jin, we do have a particular responsibility, I think, to be involved with these conversations in support of and platforming and uplifting these voices of the hibakusha. So thank you both for the incredible work that you have been doing and continue to do in this movement. And, Steven, when I was reading a little bit more about your interest in the topic too, I found that you were disappointed at maybe the sort of lack of knowledge after the 50th anniversary of the bombing, and that, there was this sort of idea that, in the 50th anniversary in 1995, that there would be this significant sea change, perhaps, in the global conversation around nuclear proliferation and around the commemoration and remembrance of these atrocities. And yet, in the aftermath of that, very little actually changed. And it seems that some aspects of the movement have lost some of the enthusiasm, perhaps. And I'm just wondering, maybe we can segue into a little bit more of the conversation of how you sort of became interested, but also how you made contact with the hibakusha, because I think Haruka really explained in great detail how she was able to reach these hibakusha. And I also read that in your film, you had interviewed something like 100 hibakusha before you found the 14 that you decided to focus on. So a few questions there.
Yeah. Well, I was drawing from pool of hibakusha that was probably almost 300 or 400 people. And some of them I had known from previous trips, and other times we just said we had open call anyone who'd like to come out to this, this high school auditorium or something and be in the film. And so we kind of auditioned people and just hunted down, try to hunt down people. I found I have mostly, for most of my film work, focused on Hiroshima, and I found Hiroshima a bit frustrating place to work, because while it's politically very liberal, and I mean, you can't be the mayor of Hiroshima without having to take a very strong stand against nuclear weapons, though sometimes there's been some issues around their support of nuclear energy. But the city, it's very liberal politically, but very conservative socially. And so people care about what other people think of them. And there was kind of a lot of pressure for people not to talk about the bomb, not coming from the government, but just coming from other people, hibakusha or not. And there were, I think a lot of people who were willing to tell their stories, but not want their faces shown, or they were willing to have their faces shown, but not tell their stories. And it's still difficult. And there's still a lot of social pressures in Hiroshima. I was working with one woman named Michiko Yamaoka, who's in the Mushroom Club, and she's a well-known hibakusha. She does unpaid tours with school groups nearly 5 days a week, and I saw her walk into the restaurant in the Peace Plaza, and no one said hello to her, and she sat by herself. And I think that's fairly typical of any of the more, I think partially because people thought she was too famous, and people were critical of that, or they thought she had too many foreigner friends. And so it's really difficult. I mean, I think another factor was they were so poor after the war. It was just her mother and her, that her mother perhaps did some prostitution to survive, and people like didn't forget that. So even in the hibakusha in White Light Black Rain, there was only one. I think there were 7 hibakusha, and there's only one, and he doesn't speak a lot. That actually lives in Hiroshima. The others live outside, up in Tokyo, and one lives in Los Angeles. And I think outside of Hiroshima, they were much more willing to speak freely. The really interesting for me was going to Nagasaki, and people were much more open. It's like, the North and the South, people were just sort of, more homey, perhaps less sophisticated, but, much more open. And people, there were never any issues with Nagasaki people about, I'm concerned what the neighbors will think or that. So, but it's still, I don't know, it's still, the most rewarding experience I've had as a filmmaker, because, when you're making the film, people go, well, anytime you're out, they go, what are you working on? And I would say, oh, Hiroshima, and people sort of a conversation ends, or if they say something, they go, wow, that's depressing. And I personally, someone talks to me about doing a documentary about, I don't know, Silicon Valley startups. I find that really depressing. And I felt so enriched. You're around people. These are the hibakusha. These are survivors. You're around people who have been through this, extraordinary, horrible experience, and they get up like, one of the people in Haruka's piece says, they appreciate every day. They have their whatever breakfast, their version of Cheerios or whatever, and they enjoy every bite, because they have been through that, and they know how precious life is, and that every day was sort of life affirming and wonderful to be around.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the things that we sort of forget in all of this is that or maybe there's a tendency to forget this. These are still places that people live, right? And these are vibrant places with a lot of happiness and joy. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki are beautiful cities, in spite of the devastation that was wrought upon them. But I tell people that my family comes from Hiroshima, and again, it's the same kind of knee-jerk response, I think, especially for Americans who don't have a connection to Japan. And I always say, like, I'm proud to have family in Hiroshima still to this day. I'm proud to be a descendant of that city. And I think because so many of the multi-generational immigrants from before World War II did come from Hiroshima-ken and Yamaguchi-ken, we have almost a majority of people within the Sansei plus generations who have some sort of family linkage to at least the Hiroshima bombing. But also a number of people came from the areas surrounding Nagasaki. So many more Japanese Americans have some kind of relationship to this than they might even be aware of themselves. And I guess that's, to me, another reason why we should kind of consider this as an important issue for Japanese Americans. Haruka, one of the things that I was really impressed with your website, I mean, first off, it's such a tremendous resource between the historical timeline and the full timeline of Japanese imperialism and sort of this play-by-play of how the Sino-Japanese War plays into the broader imperial incursions, which then leads to the embargoes with the U.S. It's hard to find that kind of content in a way that is digestible, and I think now that I'm aware of it, I'll certainly use it as a classroom resource for students in the future. So thank you for that. But I'm also just impressed with the fact that you have an actionable section of the website with petition links and ways that people can get involved in the movements. And can you talk maybe a little bit about how you see this site being used as a tool to maybe engage both Nikkei Jin and broader American public, perhaps, into this conversation of taking action around these issues.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Rob. What Steven was talking about, kind of meeting the hibakusha and understanding that they are humans, and they, even though their lives and their descendants' lives have been irreversibly changed after this, I think I would agree with Steven that that was one of that was one of the most rewarding moments of my time working on this project. And under the actionable parts, I talk about the petition for the non-proliferation treaty and links to hibakusha survivor councils and whatever actionable pieces, nonprofits that they have been working with. But another piece of that is also encouraging people to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because we have had such a lack of conversations around hibakusha and how the hibakusha community continues to thrive and evolve today. This isn't a historical piece. This is a community that is still, defining and redefining what activism looks like for them. So the one of the more important parts of the actionable pieces was really encouraging people to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Especially Nagasaki, I would say, because I think they do tend to get left out of at least a lot of hibakusha narratives in Japan. And really getting to know people. What Steven was talking about, the differences between, maybe approaching hibakusha or survivor councils in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I also noticed a change when Hiroshima, there was definitely a lot of bureaucracies and paperwork that I think I had encountered. Whereas in Nagasaki, I remember getting off the Shinkansen and hailing my first cab. And so the cab driver, I was, who's asking me what I was up to, what am I doing in Nagasaki all alone, and what's all this gear that you're carrying? And I told him about the project that I was working on, and he was like, "I'm a hibakunise, I'm a second generation hibakusha. Like, you want to take a photo of me? We can turn around the corner, we can take a photo right here." So it's again, I would highly encourage people not only to visit the advocacy organizations and to educate themselves and to sign the petitions, but also to explore Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and hopefully by reading the profiles of not only the hibakusha, but also the second and third generation, fourth generation hibakushas on the 1945 website, we can all kind of get a better understanding of what is the common denominator between us. How do we define humanity? And I think the individuals that I had the opportunity to photograph for this website really in their letters really put so much time and dedication into defining what that means to them. So I highly encourage you to go through the website. There's translations, don't worry, on the website, and also excerpts from the interviews that I was able to conduct with them.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, one of the things that it sort of made me think a little bit about, just again, in the scarcity of information here in the United States from the perspectives of hibakusha. I think both of you sort of touched on this briefly, but I'm sort of curious, in your works, respective works on this subject, have you received a lot of pushback from Americans that are kind of still blinded by the one-sided narrative that has sort of been taught within the public education system here? And if so, are you able to share a little bit about, how you've sort of dealt with some of that?
Well, the first film I did was broadcast on PBS in 1982, and I think it was a lot different for White Light, Black Rain, which was several decades later. In 1982, you really sense there was a lot of curiosity, but I think, but I don't know. It was a little scary. I mean, I got threats on my answering machine then, and responses if I did an interview. There would, but nothing more threatening than that. But they were, you know, a little unnerving. I think, but you really, there was the pushback was it was somehow an insult to the veterans, the American veterans who fought in the war, and this ridiculous thing of Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima. That Pearl Harbor happened, so Hiroshima was justified, and which you know, you don't want to even engage in that discussion. What do you gain? I mean, just like the whole discussion of, and so you got nothing but that. I mean, I think the defense mechanism on talking about the suffering of the people and the threat to humanity is just what was, you never reached that, because all that came up immediately was, well, did it save lives? All these sort of ways of talking about Hiroshima by not talking about it, really, which is what Oppenheimer does, is I mean, that sort of heartbreaking for me to watch. I mean, I just thought it's just the same. It's just, let's talk about communism. Let's talk about, you know, science. Let's talk about everything except the actual, you know, let's talk about the making of the bomb, all the difficulty, all this, you know, except let's the discussion of, you have no feeling for the horror of the bomb. I mean, in less than a minute's worth of acknowledgement of people, and the numbers that they quote at one point they said how many people died. They comes up a couple times, and someone includes the numbers of cancers, and which I thought, well, that, you know, that usually they just talk about the numbers that died on the day. They leave out over the following years, and then they leave out, you know, 10, 15 years later when thyroid cancer and leukemia reached its peak. But even the numbers they gave were the lowest possible numbers, as opposed, and so that's very disheartening. But the one thing I did feel, though, when we showed I Like It Black Rain, was, I mean, I always kind of approaching it with a lot of trepidation when you're doing press or when you're doing speaking things. And one thing I really felt was that generation, the World War II generation, had lost, really doesn't have a voice, doesn't have the voice they used to. They're not in modern communication. They're not on the, you know, on the internet, and they're, you know, really old. And so I felt like there was a sort of new, that was always tamping the discussion down. I think that there was a really much stronger interest in high schools, that, you know, that high school students could handle the information, could handle the film. And before, it's like, we have to protect, you know, this is too sensitive. So I don't know, I felt really heartened by the response to the film. It was just, there was really just totally minimal kind of Pearl Harbor kind of discussion to sort of invalidate what happened, and a lot more curiosity. And, you know, I think I think that there's an audience, you know, there are people that are really interested in the subject, young people and older people, that still don't, you know very little about it. And it's, you know, but the media is not serving that interest at all. I mean, you know, it's so minimal. It's, you know, in all the discussions of Oppenheimer, they act like they really explored Hiroshima as well. I mean, I don't really understand that. So.
Yeah, thank you for that, Steven. And I think we'll definitely unpack that a little bit further in terms of Oppenheimer and the lack of perspective. But Haruka, I'm also curious if you've experienced any sort of pushback from doing the 1945 project.
So Thankfully, I haven't received a lot of pushback in terms of, death threats like what Steven had described. I think minor criticism. So obviously the project is set up as an educational website. So my main audience is secondary school teachers to be able to use this while they're teaching this segment of US history. But I have received some feedback from teachers who are teaching lower grades saying that maybe if we can cut out some of the more graphical details, then I could teach this toward a younger audience. And it did really remind me of even at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, right? There was a huge controversy about the wax figurines and how graphic they should be, and if if they should kind of sanitize that part of the exhibit to make it more accessible to a younger audience, or if they should keep the wax figurines in order to portray the truth. And I think my responsibility as a photographer and as someone who has decided to take on these stories and to listen to the hibakusha's experiences to its fullest extent is to also portray it to its fullest extent. So I do remember an exchange that I had with a teacher regarding that, just explaining my stance and my intentions behind the more of those graphical details on the website. And another experience that comes to mind is when I was presenting this project in front of it was a university out here in New York. There was a feedback from one of the students who was saying that what about all the human atrocities that were committed by the Imperial Japanese Army? How are we going to address that? So which is why that was an important piece that I wanted to include in the historical timeline as well, to give a little bit of background context. I am not a historian by any means, but it was a resource that I thought was important to include in both this project and the Campo project that I'm currently working on.
Yeah, thanks for that. As a reminder to folks that are watching this live, if you'd like to ask questions to either of our panelists, feel free to type them into the chat and then we'll get them up on the screen. But I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, again, like how do we teach these topics? And I think also with your films, Steven, that they are really important learning resources that can be used within classrooms and also for public education. But thinking about how to carry it forward, I think about this all the time with regarding the Japanese American incarceration experience. But how do we continue to tell these stories once the people who have lived them are gone? And I think obviously in projects like both of yours, then these are great examples of ways that we can continue to not just capture, but preserve and present these voices in a first-person way to future generations. And I'm just curious if you've given much thought, either of you, about sort of what does the future look like in doing this kind of work? Like what are the next steps to take this forward beyond where we are now?
Well, I think it's obviously you have to kind of retell your story for every generation, and for me, it's not looking at your photographs, Haruka, and of both the camps and the hibakusha, it reminds you just there has to be you need to need compelling stories and compelling images. It's not just telling the story. I mean, there are a lot of publications, hundreds of publications or novels about the camps, and so many of them don't reach people because they're not. I think there needs to be art to it, and something that grabs people, that they're not just here's what you need to know, here's what you need to learn, and that and there are films about Hiroshima that just I feel like they're just propaganda for somebody's political position on bombs, you know, and but I think I kind of lost my point. I went off so far. I guess I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Thanks, Steven. Haruka?
Yeah, Stephen, I really appreciated what you had to say about, what makes a story compelling, what makes, readers and viewers gravitate toward a story. And I think, obviously, as an artist, I may be a little biased. I think artful visual approaches are something that I think about often. And also having a universal aspect, right? I think a lot about, because I've been working on 1945, and then, the Kempu is, I don't really see these two as separate projects, but kind of one is an evolution of another. It's an extension of another. And I think a lot about what is the common denominator between 1945 and Kempu. And ultimately, I think that answer is family. Right. And that is a universal concept that everyone can relate to. Some people may have, strained or negative experiences, but still there is a universal factor. There's a universality in the concept of family. And I think we can all tune into the emotions that we carry around them, the fact that our family histories are so inherently a part of us, and it's very much a part of how you navigate the world, how you show up in the world. And when, I think artists are able to tap into those very basic, fundamental, universal aspects of a story, that is when we're the most effective at telling and sharing these stories with a wider audience.
Yeah, thanks for that. Steven, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was remembering you were talking about the second generation, and I think so. When I was doing the film, we thought about doing a segment with second generation hibakusha. So we got 4 people together. Of course, like no women showed up. It was 4 guys, and I don't know, they seemed to all have sort of different ideas, and there wasn't sort of this is what we need to do, and this is how we can tell the stories. I mean, in both cities, people are thinking about devising, media, or when I was in Nagasaki, there was a project to use, I forget what they're called, but old style Japanese storytelling methods that they used to use like before movies, and then even along with movies, where they tell the story, and they would have models and little small stages, and people had ideas. But I think the second generation is the big question. I think it's really still a question in Hiroshima. I haven't seen really effective speakers or presentations yet. I'm sure that will come, but I really do think it takes time. As we were talking before this, I think as a sensei, it's really taken me my whole life to sort of understand my parents' experience beyond just the obvious, and just the deeper ways, and how much you were part of it. I was born in 1952, and at the time I thought that was a long time ago, but when in fact, it was 7. I was born 7 years after the war, but it seemed like ancient history then. And as I was growing up, and strangely, it's sort of, I feel it's closer and closer as I get older. And so I think, the next generation sort of has to process what their grandparents and parents went through, and then find a different way. You can't just, I don't think it's effective just to tell their stories from, and say, I'm the son of this person and this is their story. I think it has to come from, I'm the second generation, and their stories coming through me somehow.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. And, on that element of time, it makes me think about within our own family, the hibakusha only opened up with their stories when my Obachan and mother were visiting in the 1980s. And it was the first time that they had ever talked about it. These three sisters, cousins of my Hiobachan. And the reason they spoke about it was because my Obachan asked them, and because their parents' generation had all passed away. So they felt like they were free to then talk about their experiences with the bombing in Hiroshima. And each of them had never told each other what they experienced on that day. So these three sisters actually, for the first time ever, some 60 years later, or 50 years later at that point, but basically had told each other then what their first person accounts were of August 6th. So sometimes, again, it's that distance that's required, and obviously the time, but it does present a compelling case for Nikkei to be involved in some capacity, if only to ask the questions and make sure that there's a listening ear and a platform for these stories to be shared to a wider audience. We do have a question from the audience. Robert Shoji asks, could you and your guests talk a bit more about the commonly held belief that the bombings were a necessary evil? Steven, do you want to start us off on that one?
I try not to get involved in discussions. I don't have all the notes and facts, but I think it's a sort of pointless discussion. I mean, the nature of the atomic bombs and the effects of radiation, and the fact that, in both cities, the number of civilian casualties of men and women, mostly elderly people and children. That's who was in the cities, because everyone else was at war, and mothers. There was, it's, I don't know, I forget in what city, but it's like 85%, close to 90% of there were civilian deaths. It was not. Was it about the necessity for war? I don't know. I just think that you can just keep having that discussion, or you can really look at what the result of it was, and do you want when you talk about nuclear weapons now, are you really? It doesn't really matter. It won't matter who started the next one. It really won't.
Yeah, I think that's a great response to that. Did you have any additional thoughts on that, Haruka?
I agree with Steven that it is a matter of perspective, right? 1945 was a year of irreversible change for atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it was a year of liberation for the Korean Peninsula. It was the year in the US where they had put an end to World War II. So it is all a matter of perspective. And I think we can spend a lot of time debating these perspectives that we formed based on the information that we have grown up with. Or we can actually take the time to maybe try to understand the perspective of another person who is forming their own narratives based on the cultural backgrounds and the information that they have been given throughout their lives. So I do agree with you, Stephen. I have a hard time kind of grappling with these discussions. But one thing that I learned through working on the 1945 project is that the civilian casualties, it is unjustifiable. The human cost of the atomic bombs, I think, trump any type of ideological discussion that we can have about this issue. I think I'll leave my answer at that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Haruka. So I'll just remind our audience again, if you'd like to ask any questions, now's your chance. And my last prepared question has to do with Oppenheimer, the film. Given that that was sort of the reason for this conversation and for this focus within the film program in the 2023 Tadaima, I thought maybe we could unpack that a little bit further. We've talked about it bits and pieces sort of throughout this conversation, but I think my personal experience with it, and I'll be clear, I haven't seen the film, and I don't know that I'll ever see the film. I certainly don't want to pay to see the film. But I've heard enough from friends who have and other film critics to understand that they don't give any real context for the lived experiences of the Japanese people in this film. And I guess, part of my decision not to see the film in the theaters was looking at the commentary on social media, in the comment section on every trailer, on every promotional poster. Every third or sixth comment was something like, remember Pearl Harbor, and it just keeps coming back to that, and this failure to distinguish between the actions of an enemy nation and a military and civilians, and this idea that somehow that there's this racial inheritance of an entire people based on the military actions of their government, that they can pay the price in retaliation for something that has been done, which I think sadly fuels so many conflicts that we see around the world, including those that are happening in this very moment. But this idea that even now, close to 80 years later, we still haven't gotten to the point where we can have an honest conversation about this as Americans, to say, this is a false equivalency. These are not two of the same things. And we kind of need to think about, what does it mean to have wrought such destruction on a overwhelmingly civilian population. But I think more importantly, from my perspective, the fact that Hollywood greenlit a production like Oppenheimer and that it enjoyed the commercial success that it has indicates to me that these narratives will continue to be propagated within sort of the mainstream discourse around what has happened in the end of the war. And that's deeply concerning to me. So that's sort of my take on the film, but I'm curious if either of you had more concise thoughts around the film itself, or maybe the effect that it sort of had on the national conversation. Steven? Haruka?
Well, I don't know. It seems to me just one of the really great lost opportunities for just talking about Hiroshima. And I don't know that it was Hollywood, though, that said, that was interested in it. They wanted a new film by the guy who made Batman, and his following, I think, it was proven to be much, really extraordinary. Of course, it helped that the film came out and they had this Barbie connection, this strange thing where it connected to Barbie and made that many more millions of dollars, and people felt somehow obligated to see both films. I don't know. I really was, I thought Christopher Nolan's really gifted filmmaker, an intelligent person with liberal leanings. I did not expect it to be, this almost like a nerd appeal, fixate on the nerd appeal of the story, of the science, I mean, it just seemed like, I don't know. I've seen too many movies about sort of persecution because of communist stuff. I feel like we had that story as well. I mean, and to once more avoid the story. I mean, I can't really, I don't think the studio said keep that stuff to a minimum. I think they made a choice, and it wasn't the important part of the story for them. I just found it befuddling. I mean, it really was a 3-hour movie, and the bomb happens at about the 2-hour mark, and then it's not about, you know, dealing with the death and stuff. It's about, you know, his affiliations with the Communist Party and how that ruined his career. There's nothing really about Einstein's regret for writing a letter to signing off on a letter to Roosevelt, encouraging the development of the bomb. Yeah, I was very disappointed. I don't know when, again, these things just come, you know, really once in a blue moon. And so I don't know. You know, it's just a terrific opportunity for a real discussion of what happened in Hiroshima and the experience and what it means to us now. And there was no connection, really. The only connection I sort of made was, well, he was the Steve Jobs of his time or something. You know, it just that's sad.
Thanks for that, Steven.
Yep, I think it could have been a good opportunity for the story of the hibakusha to reach the mainstream discourse, like you mentioned, Rob. But I also think, as I mentioned a little during my presentation, that I don't think we're ready to have that conversation yet. Both the audience, who I don't think mainstream audiences are ready to receive that those stories in a whole and nuanced way. And even the hibakusha communities and the Nikkei communities, we're still gathering a lot of information. And as much as, yes, I lament that we're not making space for these conversations where we could, I think there is still a lot of learning that I know I personally can do from working with the Denshosha and actually absorbing the work of the Denshosha before entrusting these stories with someone you know, who is not a Denshosha like myself, let alone an American institution like Hollywood.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sort of putting that punctuation on it. We have another question from the audience. This one comes from Miho Visuals. Having met and interviewed hibakusha, what is your insight into the message that hibakusha would like to teach us about peace, war, and nuclear weapons? Haruka?
I have so the kind of common threads that I found through speaking with hibakusha is, of course, the plight for nuclear disarmament, right? This uncompromising disarmament of all nuclear weapons, and some hibakusha also, or many hibakusha, I would say, also have qualms against Japan's heavy reliance on nuclear energy in general. But I think I was also quite taken and maybe moved by how simple many of the messages were around, you know, peace not being kind of dictated by ideological conversations, but more about the actions that you take. I think it was the reason why I really loved, I wanted to share Mr. Yasujiro Tanaka's message about being kind to oneself, being kind to others, and being kind to yourself, that being the closing line of his message, was that after these harrowing experiences that he had as a childhood, and I'm sure the ostracization that he had experienced to being deaf in 1 year and incurring the injuries on his face, he was he was very adamant about his letter being very short and ending with those two lines. And it made me think a lot about, I approached this project thinking that, you know, hibakusha were this kind of monolithic group of people who had this deep disdain for the US, that I was going to show up and have to explain myself as someone who, you know, may look like you, but also is from my adopted home country is the United States, right? And I found a lot of these conversations were actually these kind of political conversations, weren't very necessary. Political justifications for why I was approaching this project were not nearly as necessary as I thought they would be. I found that a lot of the kind of visual or the through lines between the messages were about treating others with kindness and to protect your family members and your loved ones. Those were the common themes that I found through the letters.
Thanks for sharing that.
I just had one thought, which was, you know, I mean, the hibakusha that are willing to be interviewed or tell their stories to us, those are the people that survived, you know, not just physically, but, you know, but psychologically. And I mean, I have met a couple of survivors who just had this rage inside of them. They, you know, I met a guy in Los Angeles, and he said, you know, you know, I failed because I was a coward, because I didn't cut my mother's legs off because she was caught under the beams of the house, and he couldn't forgive himself, and he was full of rage and anger about his family. And I met a guy in the Bay Area who actually came to America with the hopes of, like, you know, killing a politician or something. And those people didn't survive. I mean, they really were destroyed by the experience. And those people were not the people that are willing to be. Both of them initially said they were interested in being in the film, but they both absolutely refused when the day came. But so what you have is, you know, the message from from the hibakusha that are left, the ones who have truly survived, and the only way to survive is to not focus on the past. And I think Japanese are particularly sort of good at saying, okay, being sort of pragmatic, is you can't. That's no way to live. And we have to look at the positive. So I think their message is really simple. You know, never, as it says on their buttons and around Hiroshima, it's never again. They experienced it, you know, and they don't want it to happen to you. They don't, you know, it's not their children. They don't want it to happen to anybody. And so it's pretty simple.
Thank you for sharing that, Steven. And again, just speaks to the diversity of the opinions and perspectives that the hibakusha have among themselves. And as a quick aside, I'm not sure if it was the same gentleman, but there is an individual who's interviewed in Shinpei Takeda's film Hiroshima and Nagasaki Download, who has a very similar viewpoint, and having at one time came to the US with a great deal of anger with the intent to create harm, and ultimately decided not to. But yes, it's important to also honor those kinds of perspectives within the hibakusha community. Well, I believe we're at the end of our time here this evening. I just wanted to thank you both so much for sharing your time with us and creating these platforms and continuing to share the work and the stories of the hibakusha. And before we close out this session, just wanted to give you both an opportunity to leave the audience with any closing thoughts, action items, takeaways.
I can go first. Oh, go for it.
No, please.
Yeah, once again, I'd I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. And again, a shout out to the JAMP team for putting Tadaima together. It's been a true honor to be able to share these projects with this community and to have this conversation, have these types of conversations with the rest of the Japanese American community. So thank you for bringing us together. These virtual pilgrimages, I know they are a lot of work, but I really stand by the sentiment behind Tadaima because it really feels like a true homecoming, being able to speak with you all and to be able to make these new connections. So yeah, thank you so much to the JAMP team for putting this together.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have these kinds of events and to make that connection, because as we were talking, the Japanese American community has been sort of separate from, because they were on such the far end, the other side of it in the war. But that I think that connection is really important because of the ties to like with your family, but just also because, I mean, in terms of the argument about the bomb, it's the question of, would people have even, dropped the bomb on non-Asian people? I think that, there's a lot to think about there. And there's a lot to just, the stories, there are a lot of stories and there are more stories. And it's surprising sometimes. You think, when I was done with my film, I thought, okay, I've gotten everything in, and then as soon as it was done, I realized how much more there was to it. And I think there are stories, as long as people are out there to tell them, whether they'll be artists and photographers or the people themselves. So thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you both again, and I can't think of a better way to end this session than what you just said, Steven. So thank you to all of our audience members. We hope that you've gotten something from this very important conversation, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your 2023 Tadaima experience. Thanks for joining us.